The truth you are about to hear is unsettling, but it is necessary. There are souls marked for something far greater than they realize. Souls chosen by God, set apart, and yet at greater risk than any other. If such a soul fails, its fall is deeper, its suffering more unbearable. If it reaches heaven, its glory is beyond measure. But if it is cast into purgatory or, God forbid, hell, the torment is unlike anything imagined. And here is the terrifying reality. You are one of these souls. You were not led here by accident. The battles you face, the trials that test you, the inexplicable burdens on your heart, these are not random. You have been called, but with that calling comes a weight that few can bear. To ignore it is to risk an agony that words cannot describe. To embrace it is to take up a cross that will either sanctify you or break you. The choice is yours, but time is short. Today, we will uncover the final visions of Saint Faustina on Purgatory. Visions so dire they should shake every believer to their core. If you are willing to see the truth, stay. If not, turn back now. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that carried an unspoken warning. Father Gabriel knelt before the flickering candle. The pages of his worn Bible opened before him. He had read these verses countless times, yet tonight, they burned differently. He felt it. A shift in the air, a weight pressing against his soul. There were souls chosen by God, marked not just for holiness, but for an unbearable burden. These souls walked a narrow path, balanced between sanctity and despair, with rewards that shone brighter than the stars, or torments that reached beyond human comprehension. He had known it for years, had felt it in the loneliness of prayer, in the crushing grief of intercession. But tonight, something more sinister lurked beyond his awareness. A whisper crept through the chapel, not audible, but an undeniable presence. A soul in purgatory, perhaps, or worse. He tightened his grip on the crucifix around his neck. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." The response was not words but a vision. He saw fire, not the fire of destruction, but of purification. Souls reaching, grasping, crying out, their pain immeasurable. And then, beyond the suffering, a light, a distant radiance, but not for all. Some souls, despite their longing, slipped deeper into the abyss, weighed down by their refusal to let go of the sins that bound them. He gasped, the vision tearing through his mind, leaving him breathless. Purgatory was real, more real than he had ever imagined. And these souls, these suffering souls, were calling him. Father Gabriel staggered to his feet, his heart pounding. He had been warned about this before. Some souls were marked by God in a particular way, called to a deeper love, but at a cost. Those who resisted, who turned away from the graces given, suffered the worst of torments. And now he understood. The battle was not distant. It was here within him. Outside the chapel, the wind howled, rattling the stained glass windows. The town had long since fallen asleep, but he knew his night had only begun. He had to act. He had to pray not just for the souls in purgatory, but for himself. Because he knew he was one of them, a chosen soul, one whose fate teetered between extraordinary glory and unimaginable suffering. He stepped outside, the cold air slicing through his robes. The old graveyard lay before him, the resting place of those who had come before, priests and sinners alike. He walked among the tombstones, whispering prayers, begging for mercy. A single candle burned at the base of an old statue of the Blessed Mother, flickering in the wind but never extinguishing. Then, a presence. It was not visible, but it was there, watching. He turned slowly, his breath visible in the frigid air. A shadow moved beyond the graves, slipping between the trees. The unease in his chest grew. "Who are you?" His voice barely broke the stillness. Silence. And then a whisper. Not from the wind, but within him. "You know who I am. A soul, desperate, bound, suffering beyond words." He knew what he had to do. Dropping to his knees, he prayed with a fervor that shook his entire being. He prayed for the soul, for its release, for God's mercy to descend upon it. But as he prayed, the air around him thickened. The presence grew stronger, closer, almost tangible. "Do not make me wait," the whisper pleaded. He gritted his teeth, heart racing. He understood now. This was not just about prayer. This was about immediate sacrifice, about surrendering everything for these souls. His time, his rest, his very self. And then he saw her, a woman, shrouded in darkness, eyes hollow with suffering. She did not speak, but her gaze bore into him, filled with agony, with longing, with an unspoken plea. "Lord, take her," he choked out, raising his hands in supplication. "Do not leave her in this torment. Let my prayers be enough. Let my faith be enough." The wind howled again, but this time it carried something else. A warmth, a shift. The darkness around her began to fade, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that had not been there before. Hope. And then she was gone. Father Gabriel collapsed, exhaustion overtaking him. But in his soul he knew he had done what he was called to do. And yet the battle was far from over. There would be more, many more. And if he was not vigilant, if he was not unwavering in his faith, the next soul to be lost could be his own. He staggered back to the chapel, the candle still burning where he had left it. He knew what he had to do now. He had to pray, to intercede, to enter purgatory as often as possible. Not just in thought, but in spirit. Because the war for souls was not fought in distant lands. It was fought here, in the silence of prayer, in the choices of every moment. And as he knelt before the altar, the words of Christ echoed in his heart. "Enter purgatory often, for they need you there." And so he did. The night had grown still, the weight of revelation settling deep in Father Gabriel's heart. He had seen, he had heard, and now he understood. This was no mere vision, no fleeting moment of spiritual insight. It was a calling, a command. He had wrestled with doubt, questioned whether he was strong enough, but there was no turning back. He had been chosen, and now he chose in return. As he knelt before the tabernacle, he whispered his final surrender. "Lord, I will go where you send me. I will not turn away." The air around him seemed lighter, as if the unseen burden had lifted. The spirits that once sought his prayers had found peace, and in their place, quiet certainty remained. He had stepped into the battle fully, embracing the mission that had been laid before him. No longer afraid, no longer hesitant, he would walk forward with unshaken resolve. His congregation had listened, their eyes wide with understanding, their hearts stirred. Some would follow, some would resist, but the truth had been spoken. Now the work would begin. He stood, gripping his rosary. The voices had quieted, but the call had not. More souls awaited, more warnings to be given. The battle was far from over, and he would not stop. The air around him seemed lighter, as if the unseen burden had lifted. The spirits that once sought his prayers had found peace, and in their place, a quiet certainty remained. He had stepped into the battle fully, embracing the mission that had been laid before him. No longer afraid, no longer hesitant, he would walk forward with unshaken resolve. His congregation had listened, their eyes wide with understanding, their hearts stirred. Some would follow, some would resist, but the truth had been spoken. Now the work would begin. He stood, gripping his rosary. The voices had quieted, but the call had not. More souls awaited, more warnings to be given. The battle was far from over, and he would not stop.